Hey everyone, I played that sizzler reel to provide a little bit of context for who we are at 21st Century Fox, and I think it helps illustrate really the diversity of content that we're producing. So we saw kind of ranging from the documentaries produced by National Geographic to the news productions of Fox News, television productions from the television studio and from FX, to international operations like Star India. And this is important context, I think, because today I'm going to talk a little bit about how we in the security function and generally the enterprise technology team think about delivering technology to the executives, to the creatives who are responsible for delivering this amazing content. And in particular, how we can enable these creatives to have the technology that they need to collaborate and to flourish, while also doing so in a way that reduces the downside risk. And for us, that downside risk is manifold, but in particular, thinking about the risk of our content being stolen and used for ransom, for extortion, or otherwise pirated by those who don't want to pay for it. And I think there's been a wide number of very prominent stories recently that have brought this more into the consciousness, from the Orange is the New Black hack to the Game of Thrones episodes that were released early. And we're seeing in the media companies space, I think, as kind of content increasingly becomes king, as there's more investment in large tentpole productions, media companies are increasingly kind of a juicy target for those that would seek to monetize their efforts. So if I look at Planet of the Apes, which I think is a good example of this complexity, this was a big tentpole for the 20th century film production studio, and this was released last summer, about $150 million production budget. The production lasted 2 years that we had to think about protecting that content. Interestingly, there were over 200 third parties that touched this content. So this is outside of Fox employees. This is the transcoding, the special effects work, the sound engineering. So 200 discrete companies we had to think about who were going to touch this content at some place, and a very geographically dispersed operation, from the filming in Canada, special effects work in New Zealand, a lot of many post-production work happening in Los Angeles. So the supply chain of content creation is exceedingly complex, and really makes us think a little bit differently about how, again, we think about security, and to think about how we can mitigate the risk of any single partner or any single employee kind of doing something that can risk the entire production or the entire enterprise. So given this context, I'm going to talk about kind of problems that we sought to kind of rethink. And I think the important piece as well is to really think about how creatives are operating in the modern world and the kind of situation we need to design around, which I think is actually not unique to media companies, but the modern way of working is digital collaboration. And with our user base, we have to enable this collaboration to happen seamlessly and without friction, because it drives our entire business. And anything that we do that introduces friction into that process is simply going to be evaded, and they're going to go around. Essentially, I think in this environment, policy essentially is meaningless. It actually holds no weight. And instead, we have to think about kind of technical delivery to facilitate that. So the two challenges that we really sought to rethink that I'm going to talk about today, I think are familiar to anyone who's worked in a large enterprise. And the first question is, how do we stop shadow IT, or how do we stop employees from utilizing technology that is unsanctioned to collaborate on our most high-value content? And then second, employee compromise, or how do we stop employees from clicking on phishing links that risk credential compromise or browser exploit or otherwise can kind of, either, again, risk the production or the entire enterprise behind it. So I'm going to start with problem one, which is the question of shadow IT. And the question I think generally people ask about this is, how do we drive down usage of non-sanctioned systems? And for us, we've really thought to put more brain power towards a different question, which is how can we drive up the usage of a system that is secure by design, and that is our desired ecosystem of technology. So if I take Planet of the Apes as an example of a real world workflow, so if you're, say, the producer of Planet of the Apes and you have to find a way to deliver revised scripts to all of your actor talent, the traditional way of handling this would really have this proprietary kind of script storage solution that you would impose upon the users, and that had a whole bunch of security features that were in place, watermarking, and everything else that you'd want. But this requires your actors then to download a new app, learn a new workflow, create new credentials, potentially VPN to get in, all these very high-paying things that people don't want to do. So what we saw is that everyone just would send things over Dropbox. And so again, the traditional response to this would be, let's monitor the perimeter. Let's look at large outbound traffic to Dropbox. That's illicit, that's not allowed, let's block it via proxy. That works, you block Dropbox. But then your users are going to go to WeTransfer and Hightail and all these other systems, and you kind of end up in this game of whack-a-mole. So the way we've thought about it instead is really, how do we think about these employees, these creatives that are our business, how do we treat them more like a consumer company would think about them? How do we think about acquiring them into our ecosystem of technology? And in this sense, we essentially are looking at what is the weekly active user count of our applications that we in enterprise technology have pushed, and how is adoption going? So this is actually a kind of abstracted version of a slide that we create weekly for our CEO, who wants to know what weekly active users are of our technology that we've delivered, and what percentage of the enterprise has adopted this technology. And in the case of scripts, which is a real example, we saw that our document numbers were essentially flat. So there's no uptake on this platform. And this confirmed what we kind of had heard, which is that no one liked the system, and so they were using Dropbox. So our response to this was to make Dropbox the sanction system, to bring that into our core delivered technology and the official platform actually for sharing documents. And then we're able to institute the things we care most about, which for me was to force multi-factor authentication. And then we can do the other things kind of behind the scenes, like monitoring alerting and having enterprise secure defaults that are important to us. And this allows the creatives to win. They get to use the platform they want. And security, I win because I get to institute the thing I care most about, which is multi-factor authentication. And the most important principle is users are now in a system that I have visibility into, and that I can actually kind of have some idea of what they're doing. So of course, this is just one app, and we have to think about all the other workflows that creatives need to do. So they need to co-create marketing materials, they want to chat with other team members, they want to do video teleconferencing. And I think what we're seeing now is really what is a rebirth for enterprise technology. I think is a beautiful consumerization of enterprise tech right now that's really kind of where it's becoming much more consumer friendly. And what that means is that in reality, almost every one of these workflows is not only served best by an individual app, but is actually served best by an individual company and a different company that you have to work with. And we have a desire in our technology team to deliver kind of the best products to our users, of emergent products, of products that our users would choose to use at home, given the opportunity. And of course, that ends up being a little bit difficult in these environments, I think, because every company wants to be a product company, wants to be a platform company. They want to keep you in their ecosystem. But this is what I think is really the modern SAS dilemma, which is how can you kind of stitch together different product offerings to deliver kind of a cohesive user experience for your users that is a desired ecosystem of products where you can push security into the app. And that pushing security into the app is really important for us. And I think I took some points from the compliance talk earlier, where I think this is a place where you cannot kind of enforce ISO certification checklists upon Dropbox and these SaaS vendors, where it's much more of a partnership, and we are asking for things all the time, submitting feature requests all the time to these companies to get the things that we really care about. And so things we've won are things like integration to our single sign-on, enforced MFA every time, more secure defaults, better logging APIs for us to do monitoring. And that's part of the dialogue. I think the biggest gap for us right now in this journey is the inter-app defaults, where essentially you want the lowest friction option to be the one that is the desired option from the security perspective, because users are going to gravitate to that low friction option. And where we see this go awry is examples like O365, which we use for email, defaults you everywhere into OneDrive, which is not our system. Slack, which we adore, defaults you everywhere into the Google Suite. And these defaults just force people into all these different applications that are not kind of in the ecosystem that we want. And this is where I think enterprise SaaS companies really have to up their game to customize what the default applications are outside of their ecosystem to be able to kind of better serve the enterprise. And this is, I think, recognized if you're a monolith like Microsoft, that people are going to go a la carte. And if you're a startup like Slack, that not everyone's on G Suite like you are. But this is kind of an evolution for all of us. And really the important principle here, again, is that the default should be the most secure and best option. So kind of based on our engagement, we've sought to really kind of DIY what is our secure ecosystem of apps that we can deliver to our user base. And this works for a few reasons. One is that our users are excited by this tech because it's the products that they want to use, and so they use it versus other products. And I mentioned earlier kind of the complexity of our supply chain. So if you have 200 different companies that in some way need to touch your content, we were forced a little bit into somewhat of the zero trust model because we essentially were getting nothing from our firewall to begin with. And we had very little visibility beyond the gate. So instead, we had to push security kind of to the app layer. And I'm really bullish on SaaS to be a kind of a cornerstone of security for us and for the industry, partially because it can be a standard that, say, multiple studios can all leverage rather than having a variety of proprietary systems, and where each of the security teams for these SaaS vendors can really kind of be a force multiplier for our security team as they think every day about how that product could potentially be abused. I should be clear that not every workflow we do has a beautiful SaaS application that's waiting for us. But Brian alluded to kind of the journey that companies can go on to go to more zero trust. And when I think about the order of operations, the right thing to do, I think, is to start with everything that's enterprise technology and move that as fast as possible to SaaS. And you leave behind what are the core things for us, like transcoding and all these things that are core to what it is to be a media company that we need to deal with, the hard problem. But so much can be carved out for SaaS on the enterprise tech side about how your employees do work. To really accelerate your journey towards more a zero trust architecture. So second piece of this is now kind of once you have this ecosystem of tech, where does risk remain? What is the residual risk in your enterprise? And for us, that's really our users and our partners who have, again, where credentials are key to everything that we do, we risk credential compromise. So thinking about phishing, I think there's two truisms that are often said. One is that you only need one click. And the second is that you can never drive clicks down to zero. And this presents, I think, kind of like an impossible situation that caused us to think a little bit about, are there slightly different questions we can ask to make a meaningful difference against the phishing problem? If we look at 2017, I think a big trend was to kind of phish your employees constantly, force them to watch educational videos, and then think that increases awareness. And I think one speaker spoke about this earlier, but that's pretty much dead and does not work in the enterprise context. It doesn't actually move the needle on the problem. And it really creates more of a culture of resentment, I think, than one of active participation on the problem. So we've sought to ask a different question, which is instead of how can I drive down the number of clickers, it's how can I drive up the number of reporters? And so again, this is asking people to kind of play an outsized role in our security team. And I'll talk about some of the impact later. And the second piece, instead of always just asking, given there's going to be some residual risk, if you accept that you can't drive clicks to zero, then if workstations are going to be compromised, kind of how do you make those workstations have as little rights as possible so that they can do the least harm? So that's instead of asking, how do we keep our workstations patched, which we need to do, and it's kind of table stakes. The more interesting question is how do we make those workstations as dumb as possible, have as few rights as possible, so they can do the least harm? So taking the phishing kind of workflow, again, we are encouraging our users to report things to the security team to be an extension of our team. So if you look at a typical campaign of phishing, might get something like 500 emails over the wire. And I think true, like most enterprises, you might see a 10 to 15% click rate. So you have something like 50 employees who might click on this over the course of 2 to 3 days. It's a really long horizon of exposure, and it's also a large number of workstations that are potentially compromised. With the workflows that we've been able to automate in our environment, we'll now see, say an email comes over the wire, within 2 minutes, generally, we have our first report. Within 30 minutes, we can have extracted every email out of the inbox of the whole campaign. In that sense, we essentially have driven the window of opportunity down to 30 minutes. We've driven the clicks down to 1 or 2. So again, I don't think this is absolutely transformational. I think we push way too much onto our users, and generally as an industry that we do. But this is a way for us to actually move the needle a little bit against the phishing problem and significantly reduce kind of contain the problem. So again, we're going to have kind of maybe 1 or 2 or however many clicks that still happen. So again, the question is, how can we make our workstations have as low privilege as possible? If we think about, like, historically, we used to be very vulnerable to things like Mimikatz for credential harvesting until we kind of made the registry changes that allowed us to detect that. We used to be very vulnerable to single machines being able to propagate harm against other machines until we removed local admin rights by default for our users, which was really popular. And we're currently doing major experiments right now about, for example, I'm attempting to work exclusively on Pixelbook, as is a large portion of our technology team, to push the envelope on how much of our work can we do exclusively delivered via the browser. So that we actually have very little responsibility in terms of being able to monitor for downloaded software and everything else, which I think is another really interesting experiment to kind of do your whole work on Chrome OS. Again, that's largely facilitated by the cloud and SaaS journey that we've already gone on. And the final thing on the scripts as well is that another thing we're doing is kind of delivering for big directors, very famous directors, their scripts via iPad systems as a specific delivery mechanism. So again, the likelihood of them being compromised is significantly reduced. So kind of summing up, I think we began with this question, of how do we think about securing the content, which in my perspective is how do you get a bunch of creatives, like the people who have the vision, who are actually driving the whole business, to be in an ecosystem of technology where you have visibility and some amount of control. And there's a few principles here. The first is kind of treat our employees like consumers, that we need to kind of integrate into our environment and earn their trust into our environment. Then to enforce the controls that we really care about, which for me is largely multi-factor authentication, but then can be a variety of other security wrappers that we implement as well. Through phishing, again, we don't do well on phishing tests, and I think we haven't found that we've really been able to kind of educate our users. But again, we're a team of creatives, not necessarily technologists. So how do we think about that problem a little bit differently, which is, I think, asking people who can have the eye to look for potentially suspicious activity to kind of be an extended part of the security team. And then to limit the residual risk that does remain by making our workstations have as few privileges as possible. So I'd love for you to join me kind of in working with SaaS companies, I think, to kind of demand the features that we need, because I think that is the way of the future for large enterprises, but that those companies kind of need to hear from enterprises what they need to get there, and we need to be asking for them. And second, I think the challenge to think about how much you can do your work via the browser and via a zero rights machine is a really interesting experiment for most organizations to be thinking about. Thanks.